I'm at the DOJ with Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dhillon. Thank you so much for doing this conversation.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Your predecessor, Kristen Clarke, weaponized the DOJ against pro-lifers and demonstrated some bias against Christians. But since you were sworn in, you've taken a different approach as Assistant Attorney General. Could you describe the ways you've departed from Clarke's leadership?
Well, on the pro-life issues, first of all, we are a pro-life administration, and that comes from the top. And I think, all the folks I work with here are very respectful of life. And so what we saw in the prior administration is there was a particular, to use your term, weaponization of a statute that we administer in civil rights called the FACE Act. And it was used disproportionately to punish pro-life protesters, even people who were just silently praying far away from the door of an abortion clinic were arrested and prosecuted, and I would say persecuted, for their views. We are seeking a more even-handed application of that statute. Statute itself is the subject of a repeal effort in Congress, but while the statute is in place, it provides protection for both people who are going to abortion clinics as well as crisis pregnancy centers, and we intend to prosecute numerous attacks that have happened on those over the years if people come forward with the right evidence that we need. And the FACE Act is also used to protect houses of worship from blockage and from attack. And so given the tense circumstances in our country right now with anti-Semitism, that's definitely going to be one of our focuses as well.
Has the DOJ begun to prosecute or investigate the people who attacked pro-life pregnancy centers and churches under the Biden administration?
Well, there are some ongoing investigations that were already there in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division. But again, sometimes these types of attacks happen and you don't have evidence. But there was a recent incident, attack on a fertility clinic in California, and 2 arrests have been made and prosecutions are proceeding under the FACE Act for those attacks on those clinics.
97% of FACE Act prosecutions from 1994 to 2024 have been against pro-lifers, according to data obtained from Merrick Garland's DOJ by Representative Chip Roy's office. What can be done to prevent the next administration, who maybe isn't a pro-life administration, from weaponizing the FACE Act again?
Well, I think there's some good things about the FACE Act. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of protections for all kinds of healthcare facilities, and so I think it really does. Any statute can be abused, okay? And so one other fact is that prosecutorial discretion allows prosecutors to select the cases they're going to bring. What I will say about cases involving pro-life facilities and crisis pregnancy centers is that I think there are approximately 200 attacks on those in the last few years, but we don't have 200 cases we can bring because we don't have evidence of who committed the crimes in many of these cases. The prior administration did prosecute a handful of cases involving attacks on pro-life or crisis pregnancy centers, so it wasn't zero, but it was definitely heavily weighted in favor of prosecution of pro-life protesters. And so we're not prosecuting protesters in our administration who are just making their views known and not otherwise obstructing people from going about their business. We believe in the First Amendment. So all I can say is that I hope future generations of civil rights prosecutors also believe in the First Amendment, because it is a critical restraint on how we pursue our jobs here in the Department of Justice.
Are there any specific attacks on pregnancy centers? I know we had one just down the street here in D.C., an attack on a pregnancy center several years ago. Are there any investigations that are about to take effect or in effect that you're able to name specific centers?
We're just not able to comment on ongoing investigations. But what I will mention is that the general federal criminal statute of limitations is 5 years. And so if there are people out there who didn't come forward because the last administration was perceived as being unfriendly to holding people accountable who attacked those types of pro-life health facilities, we are very much interested in evidence and bringing those cases. And so people should feel free to come forward. They can contact us. They can contact the FBI, work with even local law enforcement. And we would love to bring cases to hold people accountable who interfered with the right of a woman to seek health care.
Would you say that that is a big priority for you, particularly that issue?
It's a priority for us. I mean, we have a number of statutes that we cover here in the Civil Rights Division. Voting rights is a particular priority as well. We administer several statutes there. And one of the big focuses right now is also the discrimination, both DEI and anti-Semitism we're seeing on college campuses all over the United States. There's employment discrimination against American citizens by employers who favor cheap labor from abroad. That's a focus of our work. We also protect veterans' rights and disability rights.
Will career DOJ employees who were involved in targeting pregnancy centers or ignoring attacks against pregnancy centers be fired or investigated under your tenure here?
Well, again, we don't really comment on personnel matters, but what I can say is when I made the priorities of this administration clear, which are basically advancing the president's priorities, but within the context of the statutes that we administer in the Civil Rights Division, over 200 attorneys quit, and I think quite a few of those may have been along the more ideologically committed to the prior administration's priorities. I won't generalize. There may be some people who, left for different reasons or just retired, but I think there's been quite a bit of self-selection because we made our priorities very clear here.
Around the same time as the decision overturning Roe v. Wade, the Conspiracy Against Rights Act also started being used against pro-lifers praying outside of pregnancy centers and such. How is the Trump DOJ applying the Conspiracy Against Rights Act differently?
Well, look, I think there are a lot of conspiracy investigations that I'm personally interested in looking at in a number of the different areas that I've mentioned. But again, we can't really comment on our ongoing investigations. It's not fair to potential defendants, and it's also against our justice manual to do that.
Last month, the DOJ asked a federal judge to dismiss a lawsuit that seeks to limit the abortion pill, saying the case does not meet the legal standard to be heard in the federal district court where it was filed. But are you able to say if the Trump administration does support the underlying lawsuit and its restrictions on mifepristone, or if that's of interest?
Yeah, I don't think that was in the Civil Rights Division. I think that might have been a Civil Division case, so I wouldn't comment on that without digging into the file.
Absolutely. And some states have shield laws that allow shipping abortion pills across state lines into states where abortion isn't legal. Is there anything that the Civil Rights Division can do to stop this type of thing from happening?
The situation you describe is not within the jurisdiction of the Civil Rights Division. I do know that that issue is under analysis by folks in the White House and policy people. And again, I think this is probably in the purview of the Civil Division.
Before joining the DOJ, you represented Deiden, who exposed Planned Parenthood staff who sold aborted baby body parts. After President Trump took office again, California agreed to a plea deal, and Deiden has faced no punishment. Could you take us behind the scenes into the massive change and success in that case?
Well, so David had a few cases against him, and I represented him in two consolidated cases that were brought by National Abortion Federation and Planned Parenthood. And there were a number of prominent conservative lawyers involved in the defense of that case. That was a defensive case. And we tried that case to a jury trial in San Francisco, and we did not prevail in that case. And so there is ongoing litigation in other courts with David as a plaintiff and a whistleblower in Texas. And so I think at the end of the day, the value of those cases is significant, and the alleged misconduct of Planned Parenthood, National Abortion Federation providers in misrepresenting their compliance with federal law is a violation of federal law to sell baby parts. It's both repugnant and inhumane as well as illegal. So I think there's ongoing litigation there, so I don't want to prejudice or comment on any of that. But the criminal case was among the flimsiest criminal cases I've ever seen in my career. And I just played a tangential role in that as local counsel at points of time. But it is the first known case that we're aware of in California history where a prosecution was brought under the wiretapping laws against a journalist. And David was a journalist. He was an undercover journalist at the time. And the audio tapings that he made were in public places, in abortion trade shows, if you will, where he was posing as the owner of a stem cell research company, but also in hotel lobbies and restaurants in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And so to prosecute a journalist for doing what journalists do was directly contrary to numerous case precedents around the country There's a famous Food Lion case and some other cases. And so that case was like a hot potato in the San Francisco federal courts. I think judges didn't really want to be holding the bag for that abuse of the law. And so it also happened during a time when Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of California, and prominent donors were included these groups that were soliciting the prosecution. So they really used the Attorney General as their pawn to prosecute their political enemy, if you will. And so that outcome, I think, is an outcome David is satisfied with. And so it's really been my honor to represent someone so brave and principled and who made such a huge impact. It isn't just that he exposed that behavior, but the exposure of that illegal conduct by these abortion providers and abortion activists really led to law changes in multiple states, led to defunding in some states, and I hope there are future consequences for the massive human rights and civil rights violations that occurred in that dark era of our history.
How is the DOJ, under your leadership and under Attorney General Pam Bondi, handling whistleblowers like David differently?
Well, we are first bound to uphold the law, and so we try to do that equally. And so there are whistleblowers who come forward about all different kinds of legal violations. So, I mean, certainly in my office, we hear people out and then we see if we can make a case. But typically, when a whistleblower is filing what's called a qui tam, a private relator type case where you're making a claim about misconduct by a third party or a False Claims Act, if you will, that case is typically filed with a U.S. Attorney's Office and not with the Department of Justice itself. And so one of the 94 U.S. Attorney's offices in the country receives the case under file, and then the U.S. Attorney has 180 days to review it and decide whether to proceed with it on behalf of the government. But if the government doesn't proceed with the case, then the private lawyer can come forward with the case and prosecute the case. So, that, again, is something, there's a whole section of DOJ, not the Civil Rights Division, that handles looking at those cases, but we occasionally come across whistleblowers. For example, in our work on education, on DEI and discrimination that's happening on our elite university campuses in the United States, we've worked with some whistleblowers in civil rights. And, they don't always align with us in our private lives politically, and that's completely irrelevant. What's concerning is when we hear about violations of the law. And then we often see that whistleblowers experience retaliation. So I like to tell people that the cover-up is often worse than the crime. And so you really know that there's some smoke or fire there when you see the retaliation happening against someone who dares to step forward. Mm-hmm. We've experienced that in some of these college campus cases. And so we're going to be very aggressively pursuing anyone who tries to silence a whistleblower by outing them, doxing them, punishing them in some way.
You've done a lot of work in your career on parental rights violations and eliminating those. What are some parental rights issues that you're working on in this role that are particularly important and at the forefront of your priorities?
Well, again, I can't talk about specific cases, but what I can tell you is that this administration is very interested in protecting parental rights and protecting the rights of children, particularly in the trans setting. You're seeing, I would never have thought when I began my career that there would even be one case of this, much less thousands of cases of young Americans being convinced that they were born in the wrong body. But this is literally indoctrination happening to millions of American children today, and it's happening behind parents' backs. Parents don't get the opportunity to opt out. The types of teachers you see in the public schools today, and even some private schools, are completely crazy and ideological and pushing their own left-wing agenda. And so millions of American children are being damaged by this every day. And so it is a high priority for this administration to reclaim the rights of families, the most fundamental unit of government, if you will. And I consider it a natural right issue. It isn't even a civil rights issue so much as these rights come from God and they're natural rights and human rights. Our civil rights laws may play a role in prosecuting or bringing on cases that protect these kinds of rights. But what we're doing, includes working with state attorneys general in sharing information with them. There has been massive off-label prescribing of drugs that alter hormones in children's bodies that is not permitted by the FDA. So, you work with HHS on those issues. So all of these issues are being pursued by not just the DOJ, but also other government agencies. The extent to which this, I think we're going to look back on it and look at it as the lobotomy of our time, the quack medicine that has destroyed so many lives. And I've had the privilege to represent several young women who have been fooled by this cult and who had the good sense to come out of it and bear witness to the lies they were told and the bill of goods they were sold and the lies and fraud and really coercion exercised on their parents in many cases, and the absolute medical malpractice that occurred by doctors who ignored basic medical guidelines of minimum competence to push these surgeries. And what's also interesting to know is that so much of this happened during COVID, where people who were seeking necessary medical care couldn't get it, but this transgender care, if you will, mutilation I call it, was fast-tracked. And it was a cost center for many medical facilities. And so we really have to never forget this horrible episode and hold these people accountable who did that to American children.
You mentioned that sometimes these kids are getting these hormones illegally through suspicious means. We know there's online people trying to help kids make their own hormones or getting them through black markets from other states, that kind of thing. Could you talk a little bit more about what can be done by the DOJ to prevent that or crack down on those types of people?
Yeah, so that's, again, not in the purview of the Civil Rights Division per se, but in the Criminal Division and in the U.S. Attorney's offices. So our jurisdiction in the DOJ is mainly focused on federal laws, not exclusively, but mainly focused on federal laws. But whenever you're talking about a federally regulated medication, for example, that could be something that the DOJ looks at. Whenever you're talking about shipping things in commerce across state lines for an illegal purpose, that's something that the DOJ can do something about. So you want to make a big impact. We have limited resources in the government, even though there are a lot of resources. So you want to find the big offenders and the big providers who are breaking these laws and target those. So that's kind of the focus, is making an impact with, going after the worst offenders.
Reports have said the FBI may have hid information on anti-Catholic bias under the Biden administration, but this DOJ has a task force to eliminate anti-Christian bias. Could you give a preview into what that task force can do and will be doing to protect Christians?
So the Anti-Christian Bias Task Force gathers all of our federal government agencies, and the first step of that process, in fact, right here in this section of the DOJ is where we had our first meeting, and there were numerous cabinet members here for the meeting from different agencies. And each of them was tasked with identifying examples of anti-Christian bias in their agencies and then doing something to correct it. So the first part is reporting. So we've heard from Department of Defense that Christian chaplains were told to tone it down, not be so Christian in their prayers, which is silly, of course. And, there have been many other instances where, just Christians were asked to hide their light under a bushel, not to be overt about their faith. And faith is literally a cornerstone of the foundation of this country, every faith. And so, Christianity is one of those faiths. What I will tell you is in the Civil Rights Division, I don't think we're doing anything to discriminate against Christians within our agency as such, but we are prioritizing discrimination in the Civil Rights Division that we see out there. So, for example, we administer a statute called RLUIPA, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, and that protects the rights of houses of worship from being the subject of discriminatory zoning. And so we brought one case involving a discriminatory zoning case involving a Christian church. It also protects people of faith who are institutionalized, incarcerated. And so, those people also do not lose their rights to be able to worship. They may have some rights limited, but so we would take up cases involving that. I've also publicly commented on Washington State's attack on the Catholic priest penitent privilege that violates the rights not only of the priests who will be excommunicated if they follow Washington law, requiring them to report on certain confessions made by their penitents, but it also violates the rights of the penitents. So that's what people don't understand out there, is that every Catholic's rights are being violated in Washington State by this law. So, we will be doing something about that in the future.
How many people aligned with the president's principles have you been able to hire?
So the front office, what we call the front office, the management part of the Department of Justice is political appointees. And so I've been able to hire, at least a dozen outstanding people who are dedicated from all over the country to the president's agenda. And we are actually now starting to hire career people, who are being invited to apply. We have a job posting up at usajobs.gov, and lawyers who are interested in contributing to the work that we do in Civil Rights Division are encouraged to apply. But we don't apply a political litmus test to career employees, but we are looking for people who are going to pursue the priorities of this administration, and we've made those very clear. And so that is going to be a job requirement. I don't really care what people's political viewpoints are. I do care that they're willing to work shoulder to shoulder with us to advance the priorities of this administration.
Something that you've worked on a lot in the past and has been a priority for the Trump administration has been these laws that let schools hide gender identity from parents or even prohibit schools from sharing a student's gender identity with the students. What is being done or can be done about that?
So the Civil Rights Division is looking at cases that are being brought by private parties, and in private practice, I brought several cases like that. So an ethical rule that people may not know about is every case that I was involved in, or my prior law firm or my nonprofit, Center for American Liberty, was involved in, I can't be involved in those personally, but I do have a lot of other lawyers in the front office. So if there's a conflict, they handle that case. But we're looking at cases, some excellent cases that are being brought around the country, and in appropriate cases, we file, if it's appropriate, a statement of interest. Sometimes we can intervene in a case if it involves a government actor. And we can also file what's called an amicus brief and an appeal. And so we're getting involved in those cases. But what's interesting is, that manifests itself in so many ways. Just less than 2 weeks ago, I went up to Maine to argue the United States position in the case of Laura Libby, the Maine legislator, who was stripped of her ability to vote or to speak on the House of the Maine, of the floor of the Maine House by the Speaker, because she took a very mainstream position. I would call it a 90-10 position in the United States, that boys taking girls' trophies in K through 12 is wrong. And all she did was share a newspaper story about that. And for that, she was punished, but more importantly, from the United States perspective, the 9,000 voters in Maine District 90 were stripped of their representation, which is a violation of the Voting Rights Act. And so that's an angle I wouldn't have anticipated. I would never have thought that you have to go to court to protect the rights of the voters who just are passively represented by this legislator who's doing her job to highlight issues of importance to her constituents. That kind of thing is happening as well. And so you're seeing people get punished for speaking up. You're seeing cases of teachers who, because of their conscience, don't believe it's appropriate to follow school policy to conceal from parents sexual and gender indoctrination that's happening in the schools. And so they're being punished. And so there are cases out there representing the teachers. There's a case like that in California right now. So we are looking at all these cases, and it is a high priority for us to stand up for the natural rights, human rights, and civil rights of parents.
Speaking of the women's sports issue you mentioned with Representative Laura Libby, this DOJ has also launched a Title IX Special Investigations Team. Could you outline the differences between the Biden administration's Title IX interpretation and what the DOJ is using now?
I, in fact, sent a letter to California schools and California Interscholastic Federation on this very point, saying that it is this administration's position that it is a violation of federal civil rights laws to force girls to compete against boys in girl sports. I mean, that's the whole point of girl sports, is if girls and boys were the same physically, they could all compete together, but we all know biology, that's not true, and so that's why there are two different divisions, or leagues, if you will. And so the Biden administration's position was the opposite, which is that, and it's usually boys getting into girl sports, and it's, just taking their trophies. It's almost never the other way around. And so it was their position that every boy identifying as a girl, even temporarily for purposes of playing a sport and taking girls' trophies, has a right to do that. So I think that's wrong, and it extends beyond the award podium. It extends into girls' privacy rights in locker rooms. We do have one case where and I think it's Virginia, where there is a female identifying as a male who's gone into a male locker room. That's also a violation of the male rights. And I think one of the complaining students there was a Muslim, and it's against his faith to have, girls view him intimately. And I think many other faiths, and it's my faith as well, there's a concept of modesty in the Sikh faith. And so, that's not the usual fact pattern, but we've taken a position in that case that the boys have rights too. They have a right of privacy, and they have a right to not be, have their private spaces invaded either. And so it's an even-handed position in that regard, but we do not believe it is appropriate for the hard-fought rights of girls. That the whole point of Title IX is to give women equal opportunity in education and in sports. And that's being robbed by men today, and so-called feminists are standing by and advancing that. And, this is an international movement, if you will, and there's international voices, unexpected voices, major sports figures, Martina Navratilova, J.K. Rowling in Scotland, and to the point where while this country has, not had this issue like finally determined, in the UK, they've had a ruling from the Supreme Court that says that, women have their rights to private spaces and private and competitions that men cannot invade. And so I think that's encouraging to see this bubbling up to courts around the world and people beginning to come around to this common sense viewpoint.
On that protecting kids topic, is it under the DOJ's consideration that it could potentially collect trillions that it could potentially collect trillions from Apple and Google for keeping TikTok up?
That's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd check.
We have an antitrust section that's focusing on those kinds of issues.
Okay. And then, last of all, is there anything else that we have not covered that we should expect from the DOJ in the future, or that you particularly like to highlight for our listeners?
Well, I would like to highlight that the DOJ is hiring. We need good men and women to join us to help enforce federal civil rights laws. In prior Republican administrations, the focus has been to sort of just slow down, the bad things that the Civil Rights Division was doing in a prior Democrat administration. That's not our view at all. We're definitely doing that, but we're also focusing on just using the civil rights laws for good. It is a fundamental difference of opinion between us and the prior administration that we believe the civil rights laws apply to all Americans. And the United States Supreme Court's precedents are increasingly rolling in and proving our point. Before the recent Supreme Court decision that said that majority plaintiffs in employment discrimination don't have a higher burden of proof than minority plaintiffs, that was our position in the Civil Rights Division, that we are going to apply the civil rights laws even-handedly to and for all Americans. And that's happening. And so it's an exciting time to be a civil rights lawyer in the United States, and we're doing a lot of good here in the Civil Rights Division.
It seems like that's reflected really across the agencies with Department of Education's OCR, HHS. Would you say that's accurate, that throughout the Trump administration, the civil rights efforts have really been ramped up this term?
Yes, it's incredible to see this colorblind, sex-blind enforcement of the law. And, I get to go to work, and just today we announced a settlement on behalf of our service members who are being charged by cell phone carriers unlawful termination charges. We got a $500,000 settlement. So some of the cases we do aren't political at all. They're just advancing the civil rights of Americans. And so it's really exciting to be able to do that as your day job.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.